They say a man's home is his castle, the one place where the wolves outside cannot touch him. But the day my son, Michael, gave me a luxury cruise as a gift to relax, I should have known there was something terrible hiding behind that radiant smile. I had already walked out the door, my bags packed for the trip of a lifetime, when I realized I'd left my blood pressure medication sitting on the bathroom counter. I turned back. I opened the front door of my suburban Chicago home silently, careful not to disturb the quiet morning. That was the exact moment the floor felt like it was opening beneath my feet. Standing completely paralyzed behind the heavy oak door of my own living room, the words coming out of my son's mouth froze the very blood in my veins. He was talking to his wife, Claire. His voice didn't carry the warm, caring tone he always used with me. It was cold, calculating, and entirely corporate. "Don't worry, honey," Michael whispered into the receiver, his quiet chuckle dripping with malice. "It's a one-way ticket. Once the old man is out at sea, it'll be easy to make it look like a tragic accident. Nobody is going to ask uncomfortable questions about a 64-year-old who simply lost his balance and fell overboard." At that exact moment, clutching my keys until the metal bit into my palm, I took a deep, freezing breath. "If that is how you want to play it, my dear son, then have it your way. But I promise you, you are going to regret this mistake 3 times over." Before I reveal how a betrayed father transformed himself from a designated victim into the ultimate high seas hunter, welcome to Vengeance Never Sleeps. If you believe that a man who has fought his entire life, survived loss, and endured disappointments never gives up, smash that like button and subscribe right now. Before we dive into the ledger of this betrayal, leave a comment below letting me know which state you are listening from today. Whether you are tuning in from the windy streets of New York, the sunny coasts of California, the proud heart of Texas, or the shores of Florida, I want to see your name written in the books. Now, let us trace the numbers back to where this lethal investment first began. I stood perfectly still in the shadow of the hallway, a 64-year-old accountant who had spent his entire life balancing financial ledgers, suddenly realizing his own life was the asset being liquidated. I pulled the door shut behind me with the absolute silence of a ghost, stepping back out onto the porch before Michael could ever realize I had heard his dark confession. I sat in the morning cold, waiting for my rideshare to arrive, staring at the familiar brick walls of the house I had lived in for 30 years. This was the home where I had raised Michael alone after his mother died of cancer when he was only 12. I had sold my car, pawned my grandfather's watch collection, and spent every extra penny doing freelance accounting until midnight just to put him through Columbia University. I had sacrificed my own happiness, my own vacations, and my own youth so he could wear custom suits and hold his head high on Wall Street, and this was his return on investment. A watery grave in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. My hands were shaking, not from the cold, and certainly not from fear. It was a raw, burning mixture of profound disappointment and an ironclad determination I hadn't felt in decades. Michael believed his father was a foolish, fragile old man who could easily be pushed over a railing in the dark. He made the fatal mistake of underestimating a man who had fought through poverty, grief, and corporate treachery to give him a life. He thought he was sending a lamb to the slaughterhouse. He had absolutely no idea that by purchasing that one-way ticket, he had just signed the final eviction notice on his own freedom. I checked my pockets, verified my documents, and watched the Uber pull up to the curb. I was going to get on that ship. I was going to sail into his trap, but the ledger was officially open, the initial debt had been written in blood, and I was going to make sure Michael and Claire paid every single cent of it in absolute, unmitigated ruin. To truly understand the depth of the darkness that was about to unfold, we must rewind the ledger by 3 days. I was sitting in my worn leather armchair in the living room, reviewing some old tax documents, when the front door burst open. Michael walked in, carrying an energy so radiant it completely filled the quiet space of my home. He had a brilliant, wide smile plastered across his face, a smile I hadn't seen in months, as he had been increasingly distant, avoiding my weekly calls with hurried excuses. Before I could even stand up to greet him, He threw his arms around my shoulders in a strangely intense, euphoric embrace. "Dad, you're not going to believe this," Michael shouted, his voice vibrating with a theatrical excitement as he pulled back and reached into his tailored coat pocket. He drew out a heavy, shimmering golden envelope, the distinct, expensive kind, used exclusively by ultra-luxury travel agencies downtown. He pressed it into my weathered hands, his eyes gleaming. "You've worked so hard your entire life, sacrificing every single thing for this family. Claire and I sat down last week and realized it's finally time for us to give back to you. Open it, Dad. You deserve this." My fingers trembled slightly as I slid the golden seal open, pulling out 2 first-class ticket vouchers stamped with a prestigious cruise line logo. My eyes instantly filled with warm, heavy tears, blurring the text before me. A 7-day luxury Caribbean cruise, sailing through the pristine, crystal waters of the Atlantic, stopping at paradise islands like the Bahamas and Turks and Caicos. It was the exact dream trip I had quietly put off for over 30 years. Every single time I had saved enough money for a vacation, a new emergency would appear on the ledger. Michael's expensive private school tuition, household repairs, or his skyrocketing expenses at Columbia University. "Son, this must have cost an absolute fortune," I whispered, my voice caught in my throat as I stared at the luxury first-class designation on the tickets. "I can't possibly accept this from you." Michael sat on the armrest of my chair, placing a warm hand on my shoulder, his voice dropping into that soft, comforting cadence that had always melted my heart when he was a little boy. "Dad, please. Your happiness is completely priceless to us. You need to relax, get away from the crushing stress of the city, and just breathe the pure sea air. Don't worry about the money. Just let us take care of you for once." Sitting there, looking at the tickets, I felt a profound wave of paternal pride. I genuinely believed that my decades of silent sacrifice, of skipping meals and working until midnight to build his future, had finally been recognized by the boy I loved more than life itself. But in my 64 years of life, 15 of which were spent as a forensic corporate accountant, I had learned a fundamental truth. Whenever a transaction looks too perfect on the surface, there is always a hidden liability buried in the footnotes. As the initial wave of emotion began to clear from my eyes, my professional instincts quietly kicked in. I looked up at Michael to thank him again, but as I did, he quickly turned his head, pretending to check his watch, his gaze shifting erratically toward the window. For a split second, the slick Wall Street confidence dropped from his face, revealing a strange, frantic desperation underneath. "So, when do I leave?" I asked, keeping my tone light, though a cold drop of suspicion had just touched my spine. "The day after tomorrow, Dad," Michael said rapidly, his words rushing out just a fraction too fast. "Everything is already fully booked and completely non-refundable. Claire took care of every single administrative detail. All you have to do is show up at the port of Miami with your luggage. We even called the rideshare to the airport for you. The day after tomorrow, a 48-hour window." In the luxury travel industry, booking an emergency, high-end first-class itinerary with zero notice costs double the standard rate, a financial reality that a struggling broker should have avoided. Why the sudden, frantic rush? Why was he pushing me out of Chicago with such intense urgency? More importantly, why couldn't my only son look me straight in the eye while delivering a gift of pure love? I smiled warmly, nodding my head and feigning the fragile excitement he expected to see. But underneath that calm, grandfatherly expression, the accountant inside me was already opening a brand new audit folder. Michael thought he was smoothly executing the opening phase of a perfect, lethal liquidation. He had no idea that his 48-hour timeline had just given me the exact warning I needed to turn his golden trap into his own concrete cell. The port of Miami was a sprawling, chaotic sea of human celebration. Everywhere I looked, hundreds of families were laughing, taking selfies, and pushing strollers, their faces lit up with the pure, infectious euphoria of a long-awaited summer vacation. They were embarking on a dream. I was boarding a 12-story floating scaffold. Clutching the handle of my old leather suitcase, I walked among them like a ghost through a carnival. I kept my posture slightly hunched, my steps intentionally slow, and my face fixed into the sweet, vulnerable smile of an old man who was just happy to be included. It was a calculated performance. I had to play the perfect bait. If Michael or Claire had eyes on this port, they needed to see a helpless, unsuspecting target marching obediently into their trap. But beneath that fragile exterior, my mind was operating with ice-cold precision. The vibrant colors of the cruise ship, the star of the sea, looked utterly sickening to me. Its massive white hull didn't represent luxury. It was a sterile, pristine tomb designed by my own flesh and blood to swallow me whole. As my rubber-soled shoes stepped off the boarding ramp and onto the polished decks of the 8th floor, a suffocating weight settled over my chest. I watched the massive dockworkers untie the thick nylon mooring lines, throwing them into the churning water below. The space between the ship and the American coastline began to widen, first an inch, then a foot, then a yawning chasm of dark blue ocean. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket and watched the signal bars systematically drop. 5 bars, 3 bars, 1 bar, no service. That tiny digital notification was the true execution of the trap. With that disconnection, my ties to the civilized world, to the police, to emergency response, and to any semblance of immediate safety were officially severed. I was completely on my own. The crushing isolation of the situation began to squeeze my lungs. Michael had mathematically calculated this exact vulnerability. He knew that out here, in the lawless expanse of international waters, a man my age who disappeared over a dark railing in the dead of night wouldn't trigger an immediate forensic investigation. It would trigger a brief search, a formal log entry by a sympathetic captain, and an insurance payout sent directly to Chicago. I needed documentation. In my 15 years as an auditor, I learned that a criminal can lie with his mouth, but his bank accounts and booking receipts will always scream the truth. On the morning of our first full day at sea, I bypassed the bustling luxury lounges on the upper decks and headed straight down to the passenger service office on the 3rd floor. The space was pristine, quiet, and removed from the vacationers, a clinical world of bureaucratic computers and uniform-clad employees. I walked up to a polished marble counter where a young woman with a neat silver name tag reading Patricia greeted me with a flawless corporate smile. "Good morning, sir. Welcome to Passenger Relations. How can I assist you with your itinerary today?" she asked, her voice dripping with hospitality. I leaned against the desk, letting my shoulders drop, intentionally projecting the image of a vulnerable, slightly confused elderly traveler. "Good morning, dear," I said, my voice intentionally soft and trembling just a fraction. "My name is Robert Sullivan, cabin 847. My son surprised me with this beautiful trip, but I'm a bit of an old-school stickler for paperwork. I seem to have misplaced my physical confirmation layout for the entire journey. Could you print out a full, itemized copy of my travel ledger and financial booking details? I just want to make sure everything is balanced." "Of course, Mr. Sullivan. Let me pull up your account," Patricia said, her fingers flying across the keys. I watched her eyes trace the data on her glowing monitor, but within seconds, her corporate smile began to falter. Her eyebrows knitted together in deep, visible confusion. She clicked the mouse repeatedly, shifting through tabs, her face growing subtly pale beneath the office lighting. "Is there an issue, Patricia?" I asked, keeping my voice sweet, though my chest felt like it was being compressed by an iron vice. Let me check our master database, sir." "This has to be a system error," she whispered, her professional detachment cracking as she glanced up at me, an undeniable look of profound pity flickering in her eyes. She swallowed hard before continuing. "Mr. Sullivan, I am looking at the complete transactional record purchased by your son, Michael Sullivan. You have a luxury first-class reservation for the 7-day voyage, but the return ledger is entirely empty. There is no connecting flight booked from Miami back to Chicago. There is no return rail voucher. In fact, according to the final agency code submitted with his credit card, your package was flagged and finalized as a strict, non-reversible one-way deployment." The words struck my eardrums like concrete blocks. Even though I had heard him on the phone, hearing a detached, objective official read the digital proof aloud shattered the last lingering shred of my paternal denial. The ledger didn't lie. Michael hadn't forgotten to book the return. He had mathematically, legally ensured that my journey ended in the middle of the dark Atlantic. The premeditated intent was no longer just a terrifying suspicion, it was an immutable legal reality stamped into the database of a multi-billion-dollar cruise line. To escalate the psychological terror of that moment, the brutal 30% of added drama that Michael's cold calculations had forced upon me, Patricia leaned across the counter, her voice dropping into a panicked, frantic whisper. "Mr. Sullivan, you need to understand how dangerous this is," she said, her hands trembling slightly as she printed out the document. "This is peak tourist season. The flights out of Miami are completely booked for the next 3 weeks, and our return manifests for the ship's next leg are entirely locked. If you don't have an exit strategy registered right now, you will be stranded at the port with absolutely no transport, no security, and no way back to your life. It's as if whoever booked this transaction wanted you to completely vanish from the grid the moment the ship docks." I looked down at the printed itinerary she handed me. The return column was a terrifying, hollow void, a blank space where my survival was supposed to be written. Michael had purposefully tried to leave me stranded, isolated, and highly vulnerable at the end of the line, ensuring that when his hired monster pushed me over the railing, there would be no paper trail of a father trying to return home. A cold, lethal calm washed over my mind. I didn't cry, I didn't panic. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my private, unmonitored emergency Visa card, and slid it firmly across the marble counter. "Patricia," I said, my voice completely discarding the fragile old man act, turning as hard and precise as an executioner's blade. "Open the emergency seating pool for the Saturday afternoon flight from Miami to Chicago. I don't care about the cost, and I don't care about the premium fees. Charge it right now. Print the ticket, stamp the corporate seal of the cruise line on it, and log the exact timestamp of this purchase into the federal server." Beep! The terminal processed the $750 charge. I snatched my card and the newly printed return ticket, holding the physical proof of my survival tightly in my hand. Michael thought he had written a flawless, lethal script where his father quietly dissolved into the ocean. He had no idea that by leaving that return ledger blank, he had just handed me Exhibit A for a future murder trial. I had just secured my exit, I had locked down the evidence of his premeditation, and now, the hunter was stepping out of the office to locate the target. Michael's countdown had officially begun, and his debt was about to be collected in full. With the printed proof of Michael's deadly premeditation folded tightly inside my breast pocket, I walked into the grand dining room for lunch. I needed a public space to think, a crowded room where an assassin couldn't strike without hundreds of witnesses. I sat alone at a small table by a massive panoramic window, staring out at the endless gray expanse of the Atlantic, completely ignoring the expensive food in front of me. That was when a shadow fell across the white tablecloth. I looked up to see a man in his early 60s, sporting perfectly groomed silver hair and an impeccable navy blue blazer. His posture was commanding, but his eyes carried the deep, weathered wisdom of someone who had seen the absolute worst of human nature. "Mind if I join you?" the man asked, his voice a gravelly, warm baritone. "I absolutely despise dining alone, and frankly, you look like a man who is currently carrying the weight of the entire world on his shoulders." His name was Carl Anderson, a 62-year-old widower from Denver, Colorado. As we conversed over coffee, I discovered Carl wasn't just another wealthy tourist passing the time. He was a retired oil executive who had spent decades navigating the cutthroat corporate boards of the Midwest. He had raised 4 children alone after losing his wife, and most importantly, he understood the bitter sting of ultimate treachery. He casually mentioned how his former corporate partner had embezzled millions, nearly bankrupting his legacy before Carl systematically dismantled him. Carl stopped speaking, locked his sharp, piercing gaze onto mine, and leaned forward over the table. "Robert," Carl said, lowering his voice into a deadly serious whisper, "you've been staring at that ocean as if it's a crime scene. I've spent 30 years reading men in boardrooms. You aren't seasick, and you aren't nervous about a vacation. You are in deep, dangerous trouble. What is it?" I looked into Carl's eyes and made a split-second executive decision. In my line of work, you learn to read liabilities, but you also learn to recognize an unshakable asset. I needed an ally, someone completely disconnected from Michael's social circle, someone with an objective, calculating mind. I pulled out the printed travel ledger Patricia had given me and laid it flat on the table. For the next 20 minutes, I laid the cards face up. I told him about the phone call I overheard in Chicago, the fraudulent loans cashing out my house, the life insurance policy, and the chilling confirmation that my son had deliberately sent me out to sea on a strict one-way ticket. Carl listened without a single interruption, his jaw tightening into a hard, rigid line, his knuckles turning white as he gripped his coffee mug. When I finished, he didn't pity me. He didn't look at me like a frail, broken senior citizen. His eyes flared with a cold, righteous fury. "That absolute piece of garbage," Carl hissed, his voice vibrating with pure steel. "To weaponize the love of the man who built his entire life is an abomination." He reached across the table, his hand slamming down firmly over the legal document. "Consider the ledger balanced between us right now, Robert. You aren't fighting this battle alone anymore. I've buried a wife and built an empire from nothing. I am certainly not afraid of a spoiled, bankrupt Wall Street brat who wants to murder his own father for a quick payout. We are going to take this boy down." Once Carl exposed the fatal blind spot of cabin 847, we knew we couldn't just sit in the dark and wait to be liquidated. We needed to flush the predator out into the open, but we had to do it on our terms, under the blinding glare of security lenses. By late afternoon, Carl's sharp eyes had already picked up a dangerous pattern. A tall, muscular man in his early 40s, wearing a garish, overly bright tropical shirt, had been shadowing my movements from the upper decks down to the lounges. He was trying to look like a careless tourist, but his eyes were completely dead, locked onto my back with a clinical, predatory focus. "We don't run from him, Robert," Carl whispered as we surveyed the crowded hallway. "We drag him onto a stage where he thinks he's in control. The Royal Casino on the 5th floor. It's packed with people, but more importantly, it has the highest concentration of high-definition security cameras on this entire ship. If he touches you there, he's finished. We are going to feed him the bait." I stepped into the neon-lit smoke of the casino alone, leaving Carl to secure a strategic position at a high-stakes poker table near the main entrance. I took a deep breath, letting my spine curve, intentionally projecting the ultimate image of an old, vulnerable man who had lost his grounding. I picked a flashing slot machine near a major security dome and began my performance. I staggered slightly against the plastic casing, slurring my words as I talked loudly to myself, pretending to be completely disoriented by a morning of free-flowing mimosas. "Come on!" "Just one lucky spin for an old-timer," I muttered, shaking my head with a foolish, glassy-eyed smile. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the bright, tropical fabric of the shadow moving through the crowd. He saw my staggered steps, my loose posture, and my apparent intoxication. He thought his prey had just handed him the perfect, helpless window of vulnerability. He walked over confidently, sliding onto the stool right next to my machine, slipping a $100 bill into the feeder with a practiced, predatory smoothness. "Rough day at the reels, sir?" the man asked, his voice low, calculated, and dripping with an uncomfortably forced friendliness. He had short, dark hair and a jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow. "Oh, it's these wonderful morning mimosas," I replied, laughing heavily, letting my body sway unsteadily as I pressed the spin button. "My son gave me this trip to relax, but I think these luxury drinks are winning the battle." The man smiled, and I watched his pupils dilate with a sickening, victorious glee. This was the extra 50% of raw, terrifying drama that Michael had engineered from Chicago. This wasn't just a random thug. This was a professional cleaner executing a cold-blooded contract. He leaned closer, his shoulder almost touching mine, his voice dropping into a deadly, quiet frequency. "A thoughtful son," the stranger murmured, his eyes locking onto my face like a targeting radar. "You need to make the most of it. Have you been spending time out on the upper decks? Watching the midnight ocean from the railings can be incredibly peaceful." "Oh, heavens no," I said, shuddering violently on cue, leaning in as if sharing a deep, fragile secret. I stay completely away from the edges. I'm a terribly clumsy old man, you see. Even on my private balcony in cabin 847 on the 8th floor, I get completely terrified just leaning over the land can to look at the water. One bad wave, one little slip of my balance, and a man my age would disappear forever into that black void. Cabin 847, 8th floor, balcony. Fear of railings. I had just handed him every single piece of data he needed to finalize his murder plan. I watched his face tighten into a cold, triumphant mask. He had just received the exact room number and the perfect tactical alibi from the mouth of his own target. "You're very wise to be cautious, Mr. Sullivan," the assassin said, standing up from his stool without even playing his credits, his smile turning completely razor-sharp. "Enjoy your mimosas. I'm sure you'll have a completely unforgettable night." He turned and walked rapidly toward the public house phones, completely unaware that Carl's lens was already recording his exit from across the floor. He thought he had just smoothly harvested the coordinates of an easy execution. He had absolutely no idea that by taking that poisoned intel, the predator had just officially stepped into the jaws of the trap. The moment the assassin turned his back and walked away from my slot machine, Carl slipped out from his poker table like a shadow cutting through fog. He kept a precise, military-grade distance, tracking the bright, garish shirt through the maze of the ship's luxury corridors. The hunter didn't use his personal cell phone. He knew the maritime satellite roaming data could be subpoenaed. Instead, he slipped into a quiet alcove near the public payphones on the upper deck, believing he was completely isolated. Carl rounded the corner, pulling out his smartphone, pretending to be deeply engrossed in a digital brochure while activating the device's high-gain microphone. Every word that bled out of the assassin's mouth into the receiver was captured in pristine, uncompressed audio. "Yeah, it's me," the killer murmured, his voice discarding all tourist cordiality, dropping into a flat, chilling professional drone. The asset just confirmed everything himself. Target is in cabin 847, 8th floor, private balcony. The old man is terrified of the railings and completely loaded on mimosas. He won't even have the balance to struggle. It's a clean setup. The void is wide open. I'll finalize the liquidation exactly when we planned. When Carl met me back in the central lobby, his face looked as if it had been carved from white ice. He didn't say a single word until he dragged me into the elevator, pressed the button for the 12th floor, and shoved me inside his private executive suite, cabin 1247. He slammed the heavy door shut, locked the deadbolt, and threw the safety latch forward before turning to face me. "You are never setting foot inside cabin 847 again, Robert. Not for the rest of this entire trip," Carl said, his voice trembling with a mixture of raw adrenaline and absolute authority. He held up his phone, playing back the intercepted recording. Hearing that cold, anonymous voice detail the precise mechanics of my planned death made my skin turn completely numb. This was the extra 60% of dark, suffocating drama that my own flesh and blood had unleashed upon my life. Michael hadn't just bought a ticket. He had provided a professional executioner with a step-by-step tactical script to dump my body into the dark Atlantic currents. "You're sleeping on my living room sofa," Carl ordered, throwing a fresh blanket and pillow onto the plush leather couch. "Let them break into your empty room. Let them stalk an empty balcony. From this second onward, we turn this cabin into an active command bunker. We are no longer defending, we are gathering the rope to hang them." Right on cue, at exactly 10 p.m., my smartphone began to vibrate violently on the glass coffee table. The screen illuminated with a single name, Michael. Carl immediately reached over, plugging my phone into a dual-channel line recorder connected to his tablet, ensuring every frequency would be locked down with an immutable digital timestamp. He gave me a sharp, commanding nod. "Make him talk. Lock down the liability." I took a deep, steadying breath, forced the shaking out of my chest, and slid the answer bar forward, injecting the fragile, sleepy warmth of a loving father back into my voice. "Hello, Michael? Is everything all right, son?" I asked softly. "Hi, Dad. Just checking in on you," Michael's voice bounced through the speaker, dripping with that nauseating manufactured euphoria. We were just sitting here thinking about you. Are you back in your room, getting some good rest in cabin 847? Carl's eyes locked onto mine, his pen quickly circling the words cabin 847 on his notepad. Michael was fishing, verifying the target's exact coordinates for his hired monster. Oh yes, son, I lied flawlessly, staring directly at the ceiling of Carl's 12th floor suite. The mimosas really caught up with me today. I'm tucked into bed right now, listening to the waves from the balcony door. It's so quiet out here on the 8th floor. A brief, suffocating pause stretched over the satellite line before Michael replied, his voice dropping into a tight, strained frequency. That's wonderful, Dad. Just stay inside and keep that balcony locked tonight. The sea wind can be incredibly deceptive. I love you, Dad. Get some deep sleep. I love you too, Michael. Good night, I murmured, hanging up the line. Bleep. The recording terminated, saving the audio file into Carl's encrypted cloud server. I looked up at Carl, the residual sorrow of a betrayed parent completely evaporating from my soul, leaving only the hard, unyielding calculus of a forensic auditor. Michael thought he was smoothly verifying the final logistics of an untraceable murder. He had absolutely no idea that every single caring word coming out of his mouth was being systematically woven into a federal indictment. The trap was laid, the recording was archived, and the countdown to his absolute ruin was ticking away in the dark. While the rest of the passengers were basking under the Caribbean sun, Carl and I retreated to the absolute isolation of the ship's third-floor digital library. It was a quiet, dimly lit sanctuary of monitors and data portals, the perfect place to dissect a crime. I logged into a secure, heavily encrypted virtual private network using an old, unmonitored server gateway. My palms were cold as I opened my private email terminal. Waiting in the center of the screen was a single, password-protected attachment from Frank Harrison, the private detective I had retained back in Chicago. Frank was a seasoned ex-homicide investigator who didn't deal in guesswork. He dealt in cold, brutal facts. I punched in the multi-layered security key, and the file unraveled onto the high-definition monitor. The data that stared back at me didn't just break my heart, it systematically incinerated it. Michael's true motive for wanting me erased from this earth was infinitely darker and more desperate than a simple desire for early inheritance. The forensic audit of his hidden bank accounts revealed that my only son was a functional monster drowning in a catastrophic financial void. Over the past 18 months, Michael had developed an aggressive, uncontrollable addiction to illegal, underground sports gambling. He hadn't been losing money to traditional casinos. He was completely indebted to a brutal, black market bookmaking syndicate operating out of Cook County. The ledger showed a massive, terrifying negative balance. Michael owed these dangerous criminal syndicates exactly $200,000. The threatening emails and burner text messages Frank had intercepted proved that the loan sharks had issued a final ultimatum. If the debt wasn't cleared by the end of the month, Michael wouldn't just lose his career on Wall Street, he would lose his life. "Robert, do you hear me?" Frank's voice hissed through the secure earpiece, vibrating with a deep, professional urgency. "I'm looking at the county property records right now. It gets much worse. You need to brace yourself." "Give it to me straight, Frank," I whispered, my voice completely devoid of emotion, turning into the cold steel of a veteran accountant. "Don't hide a single number. Michael didn't just plot your death, Robert. He already liquidated your life while you were still breathing," Frank revealed, the sound of papers rustling through the line. 3 months ago, your son utilized his access to your personal documents. He hired a corrupt notary and meticulously forged your signature on a hard-money second mortgage application. He used your family home, the house you worked 40 years to pay off, the house full of your late wife's memories, as collateral to secure a predatory, short-term loan from a hard-money lender to pay off his initial gambling interest. And he wasn't working alone. A second financial profile flashed onto the monitor, illuminated in harsh red text. It belonged to my daughter-in-law, Claire, the woman who had picked out the cruise, the woman who had meticulously arranged the details of my trip. Claire was drowning in her own secret, black market financial crisis, holding over $50,000 in maxed-out, hidden credit card debt and predatory luxury lifestyle loans. They were two desperate parasites, completely backed into a corner, facing public humiliation, bankruptcy, and physical retaliation from the criminal underworld. This was the extra 70% of raw, unadulterated drama that my own blood had engineered behind my back. This wasn't a sudden crime of passion or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a cold, calculated business transaction where my life was the currency. I looked at the final spreadsheet Frank had put together, analyzing the exact financial payout of my planned death. The mathematics of their murder plot were flawless in their cruelty. Item 1, the active life insurance policy I had maintained through my old accounting firm, was worth exactly $200,000, with Michael listed as the sole undisputed beneficiary. Item 2, the equity in my suburban Chicago home, once the property cleared probate after a reported accidental drowning at sea, would yield another $300,000 upon a rapid, prearranged cash sale. The total value of my corporate liquidation was exactly $500,000 in immediate, untraceable liquid cash. It was the exact amount needed to wipe Michael's $200,000 gambling debt off the books, eliminate Claire's $50,000 credit card liability, and leave them with a clean, luxurious $250,000 slate to restart their lives in New York. My death was their ultimate financial escape route. They had sat at their elegant kitchen table, calculated the cost of my breathing against the value of my corpse, and decided that my life wasn't worth the margin. I took off the headset, the digital library fading into a cold, absolute silence. Carl looked at me from across the desk, his eyes reflecting the horrific data streaming down the monitors. I didn't shed a single tear. The grief had completely burned away, leaving nothing behind but the sterile, lethal calculus of a master auditor. Michael and Claire thought they had designed an airtight financial exit strategy. They had absolutely no idea that the scalpel had just completed the final autopsy on their fraud. They had written my name into the execution column, but by forging my signature, they had just hand-delivered the definitive evidence that would destroy their lives forever. The audit was over, the liability was absolute, and the collection was going to be total. With the forensic audit of my son's catastrophic debt locked securely in our possession, Carl and I bypassed standard channels and went straight to the highest authority on the water. Inside the sterile, high-tech command center of the bridge, Captain John Peterson sat in absolute, stunned silence as we laid out the evidence. We played the high-gain audio recordings of the hitman's corridor reports, showed the digital logs of the one-way ticket fabrication, and handed him the deep financial treason files compiled from Chicago. Captain Peterson, a hardened 20-year maritime veteran, looked at the spreadsheets, and his face turned to pure stone. "Not on my ship," he whispered, his voice vibrating with an icy, authoritative fury. He didn't hesitate. With the captain fully integrated into our alliance, the cruise ship transformed from a luxury resort into a massive, floating intelligence trap. Captain Peterson immediately ordered his elite, plainclothes security detail to discard their uniforms and blend into the crowds as wealthy passengers. Within 2 hours, micro-sized, military-grade pinhole cameras were seamlessly installed along the structural blind spots of the 8th floor corridor, wired directly into an encrypted monitoring station on the bridge. We were no longer hiding from the predator, we were explicitly constructing the cage. The night of the captain's gala arrived, a spectacular display of champagne, tailored tuxedos, and diamond jewelry. Down in the grand ballroom, I executed my final performance, wearing my elegant green suit, smiling warmly, and pretending to be completely lost in the celebration while the assassin watched me from the bar in his white dinner jacket. At precisely 11:30 p.m., I staggered away from the crowd, making a highly visible exit toward the elevators, as if retiring for the night. But instead of going to my room, I slipped up the fire stairs to the 12th floor to join Carl in his command bunker. We watched the glowing security monitors on the bridge terminal, our hearts hammering against our ribs. At exactly 12:15 a.m., a shadow detached itself from the service stairwell on the 8th floor. It was him, The assassin had discarded his flashy clothes for dark, tight-fitting garments. His hands were covered in professional black leather gloves. We watched through the hidden lenses as the killer slipped inside my empty room, moving with the terrifying smoothness of a professional executioner. He didn't turn on the lights. He used a narrow, low-intensity tactical flashlight to sweep the bed, and finding it empty, he marched directly toward the open balcony door. He stepped out into the freezing Atlantic wind, leaning his heavy frame over the cold metal railing, gripping the steel, and inspecting the slick surface to calculate the exact physical trajectory needed to dump a 64-year-old body into the bottomless ocean void. He was completely focused on the mechanics of my death, entirely convinced he was operating in a perfect visual blind spot. Federal security, don't move. The transition from a silent trap to an absolute operational massacre took less than 3 seconds. 3 towering, plainclothes security agents, weapon lights blindingly bright, exploded through the corridor door and swarmed the balcony, pinning the assassin violently against the very steel railing he had intended to use as my gallows. He fought like a cornered animal, his boots kicking against the balcony glass, but the leverage was absolute. Within seconds, his arms were wrenched behind his back, and the heavy steel cuffs snapped around his wrists. Carl and I stepped into the room alongside Captain Peterson just as the lead agent lifted the killer's personal, encrypted smartphone from his tactical pocket. The device was still illuminated, completely unlocked, and logged into a secure messaging application. This was the extra 80% of raw, suffocating tension that Michael had engineered from his luxurious office in Chicago. I looked down at the screen, reflecting in the darkness of my room. Stamped with a real-time digital clock verified by the ship's server, a direct text message from Michael's private number stared back at me. The text read, "Execute the liquidation immediately after midnight. Make sure the railing is wet. Push him over cleanly and erase every single trace of a physical struggle." Claire and I are waiting for the confirmation call to initialize the insurance claim. The smoking gun was entirely undeniable. Michael hadn't just left a passive financial trail, he had explicitly issued a cold-blooded, step-by-step written execution order to a hired hitman while his father was out at sea. I stared at my son's words on that screen, the final vestige of my paternal grief completely hardening into a diamond-sharp resolve. He had written a perfect script for an untraceable accident, but by sending that final text, he had just legally signed his own 20-year prison warrant. The assassin was dragged down to the brig in heavy chains, the evidence was digitally locked in the ship's master safe, and the hunter was finally ready to call his son to settle the final balance of the ledger. The Star of the Sea glided back toward the port of Miami under the crisp morning sun. I stood on the bridge right next to Captain Peterson, holding the assassin's unlocked smartphone. The countdown had hit 0. I dialed Michael's private number. He answered on the very first ring, his voice practically vibrating with an anxious, sickening anticipation. "Dad? Oh my God, Dad. Is that you?" Michael blurted out, trying desperately to sound like a mourning son prepared for bad news. "Are you all right? I've been trying to call your room all morning." "Good morning, Michael," I said, my voice completely smooth, calm, and as cold as a winter morning in Chicago. "I'm doing exceptionally well. I'm currently standing on the command bridge, looking at a beautiful view of the Florida coastline. A suffocating, dead silence stretched over the satellite line. I could hear his breath hitch in his throat. "I called to let you know your transaction has officially failed, son," I continued, cutting through his silence like a scalpel. "At exactly 12:15 last night, your hired cleaner entered cabin 847 with professional lockpicks and black leather gloves. Unfortunately for your investment strategy, the room was entirely empty. He was caught red-handed on the balcony by Federal Maritime Security. And right now, I am looking directly at the text message you sent him, explicitly ordering him to push me over the railing and wet the steel." "Dad, no, wait, that's a mistake, I swear," Michael stammered, his polished Wall Street confidence instantly shattering into a pathetic, whimpering sob. His voice cracked with pure, unadulterated terror. "Please, Dad, I was desperate. They were going to kill me." Claire and we didn't have a choice. Please don't do this to your own son. Do not call me your father ever again, I replied, my voice dropping into a deadly, unyielding register. A father is someone who is protected and loved. To you, I was just an asset to be liquidated for a $250,000 payout. The audit is finalized, Michael. Your liability is total, and the debt is due today. I slid the end call bar forward, severing the connection before he could utter another desperate plea. The moment the ship's gangway lowered in Miami, the physical evidence, the high-definition corridor video, the intercepted text messages, and the hitman's signed confession was electronically transferred directly to Chief Carlos Martinez at the Chicago Police Department. Driven by absolute, cornered panic, they had frantically shoved their designer clothes into luxury suitcases and booked 2 one-way tickets to Toronto, attempting a desperate cross-border escape. They didn't even make it to their car. Chief Martinez and a tactical unit intercepted them right inside the foyer of their suburban home. The heavy battering ram smashed through their elegant front door, pinning Michael against the wall as he tried to drag his suitcase toward the back exit. Claire shrieked hysterically, dropping her expensive handbag as the cold steel handcuffs snapped around her manicured wrists. The legal retribution was swift, systematic, and completely ruthless. The United States District Court buried them under an avalanche of my financial and forensic evidence. For the charges of attempted murder, criminal conspiracy, bank fraud, and forging my signature on a predatory mortgage, Michael was sentenced to a brutal 18 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Claire, for her active complicity and financial fraud, was handed a definitive 8-year prison term. They had plotted to steal my life to pay off their gambling debts. Instead, they paid for their greed with their own youth, locked inside concrete cells where the numbers would haunt them forever. 6 months later, the toxic shadow of their betrayal had completely evaporated from my life. I sold the old family home, the place that had been stained by Michael's forgery and greed, and used the liquid capital to purchase a stunning, sun-drenched high-rise apartment in downtown Chicago. But I didn't spend my money on hollow luxury. I established the Robert Sullivan Foundation, an ironclad charitable trust dedicated to providing legal protection, financial auditing, and emergency housing for elderly citizens who were victims of domestic and financial abuse. I was no longer the fragile old man sacrificing his life in silence for an ungrateful child. I was a man reborn. Tonight, I am standing in a brightly lit dance studio, the vibrant rhythms of swing and salsa music filling the air. My feet move with a fluid, effortless confidence that I hadn't felt since I was a young man. Right beside me, laughing as he executes a perfect turn, is my battle brother, Carl Anderson. We had navigated the darkest waters imaginable, and we had emerged completely victorious. I looked at my reflection in the studio mirror, adjusting the collar of my shirt, a profound, unshakable peace settling deep into my soul. They looked at my gray hair and my quiet accountant smile, and they assumed I was a defenseless lamb waiting for the slaughter. They forgot that the same discipline it takes to balance a corporate ledger is the exact same discipline it takes to execute a perfect retaliation. I didn't want a bloodbath. I wanted justice. And today, every single account has been audited, every liability has been cleared, and my books are finally balanced perfectly. Because in this life, vengeance never sleeps. What would you have done if you discovered that your own flesh and blood had crossed out your return ticket to life just to clear their own gambling debts? Would you have accepted the fall, or would you have turned the cruise into a hunter's trap? Let me know your thoughts on Robert's ultimate financial audit in the comments section below. If this story of a father's quiet, absolute justice brought a sense of righteous satisfaction to your soul, show your support right now. Smash that like button, hit the subscribe button for the Vengeance Never Sleeps channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another surgical strike against betrayal. If you want to keep this channel running and support more stories of absolute accountability, consider sending a super thanks. Every bit of support helps us balance the books against the wolves. Thank you for listening. Stay sharp, stay vigilant, and until the next audit, remember, vengeance never sleeps.